Please join me in giving Dwight D. Keene a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Some of you, I think, can maybe empathize with my need to wear glasses so that I can hear. Today's function of age. The younger ones won't appreciate that fully. Thank you very much, John. I'm honored again to speak before a Pachyderm luncheon, this time about the Kansas Corporation Commission. This is the third time I've been honored to speak before Pachyderm. I'm not certain, but I think it might be John Todd's theory that if I'm invited back enough times, eventually I might get it right. Whether or not today is that day, time will tell. At the outset, I must note that the views I express this afternoon are my own and not necessarily the views of the Kansas Corporation Commission. March 2019 marks my 11th month as a KCC commissioner. In reflecting upon this experience, my objective this afternoon is twofold. First, to provide an overview of the scope and the regulatory responsibilities of the KCC, including providing some insight into our regulatory philosophy and management approach. And second, I will address four important issues presently confronting the Commission and Kansans, issues that I believe are of current interest to you. More specifically, we will consider the issues of utility rate making and rates in Kansas, abandoned oil and gas well identification, remediation, and plugging, seismicity and recent seismic activity in Kansas, and natural gas distribution pipeline safety. Piece of pie, right? Groucho Marx once quipped that government is expert at looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and providing the wrong remedies. At the time this observation was made, it was directed toward the federal government, so obviously he wasn't referring to the Kansas Corporation Commission. Within Kansas government, the Commission is a very unique agency. In essence, the KCC regulates 5 major industries: electric utilities, natural gas distribution utilities, natural gas pipeline utilities, motor carriers, and of course, the Kansas oil and gas industry. Interestingly, each of these industries is unique with few commonalities among them. As a footnote, I think it's important for your frame of reference that you also note that what the KCC does not regulate. We don't regulate most electric cooperatives, water cooperatives, municipal utilities, wireless telephone, long-distance service, cable companies, or the internet. To fulfill its responsibilities with respect to the 5 industries we do regulate, the KCC operates through 4 major core divisions. The Utilities Division, which oversees rates and terms of service for the various regulated utilities. The Conservation Division, which regulates the Kansas oil and gas industry. The Transportation Division, which regulates motor carriers and commercial trucking safety. And the Energy Division, which administers programs and provides information about energy conservation, energy efficiency, and alternative energy. Given the scope of these regulatory responsibilities, whether considered individually or collectively, the KCC has a significant impact not only upon the public welfare and safety, but also upon the economic growth, development, and general well-being of all Kansans. In an effort to responsibly execute these diverse regulatory responsibilities, the Commission is committed to several managerial objectives, principles, and approaches. It is important to highlight and review these matters for you, I think, because so frequently process influences outcomes. Foremost among our managerial objectives is a commitment to good government and the ongoing maintenance or enhancement of professionalism at every level of agency operations and administration. I believe that this goal is best achieved by an ongoing commitment to focus upon improving the execution of agency core functions and missions. For the Conservation Division, this means regulating the oil and gas industry in a manner that protects correlative rights, protects the freshwater resources of the state, and prevents waste in the production of oil and gas. All of this without inhibiting the responsible development of our important oil and gas resources. In other words, regulating Kansas oil and gas exploration development activities to assure that they are conducted in a responsible manner that protects the freshwater resources of the state. For the Utilities Division, this means regulating the rates and terms of service of the various regulated utilities, be they monopolies or oligopolies, in a manner that provides the utilities with a fair rate of return on their invested capital while simultaneously ensuring that consumers have reliable service at just and reasonable rates, and trying to accomplish all of this while maintaining a safety net for those truly least able to pay for their utility services. To achieve these mission-specific objectives, other important agency-wide managerial goals include a commitment to transparency and improved communications with the public and the regulated industries. I thank all of you and John Todd for giving me this forum to realize that objective in part. In an effort to improve informed decision-making and reduce the risk of regulatory isolation, pursue an open-door policy that encourages agency consideration of relevant information about the real-world circumstances and conditions confronted by the citizens of Kansas and by the regulated entities. With regard to the protection of our environment, pursue proactive policies that simultaneously encourage environmental stewardship and the responsible development of our state's oil and gas resources, important resources that positively and tangibly contribute to our standard of living and our quality of life. With regard to the review or reassessment of existing regulations or the development of new regulations, utilize appropriate forms of rigorous cost-benefit analysis to determine whether the real benefits to be realized from any regulation exceed the total costs of compliance, and whether legitimate regulatory goals are actually accomplished in the most practical and cost-effective way for the Commission, for the regulated entities, and most importantly, for and in the long-term public interest. In an effort to institutionalize these goals, the Commission has recently formally adopted revised bylaws, or internal guidelines, if you will, to govern Commission administrative practices and procedures. In essence, these revised bylaws specifically, first, strive to remove political considerations from all internal policies and procedures, and most specifically remove political considerations from all personnel and budgetary issues. And second, encourage all commissioners, not just the chair as it has been historically, but to encourage all commissioners to fully participate in and share responsibility for the two most important agency administrative functions, personnel decisions, and the budget. Okay, with these goals as a backdrop, let's briefly consider four important current issues that are currently confronting the agency. First, utility rates and rulemaking in Kansas. In August 2018, the Commission approved major revisions to the Wolf Creek decommissioning plan in an effort to more thoroughly protect both current and future ratepayers from the significant costs associated with plant decommissioning and the safe disposal of spent nuclear fuel. In May of 2018, the Commission approved the merger of Westar and Kansas City Power and Light, the state's two largest electric utilities. A major condition to that merger was a negotiated commitment from the combined utility to a 5-year rate moratorium on future rate requests. Furthermore, during 2018, the Commission considered two important electric utility rate cases. The first of these involved Westar. In February of 2018, Westar had filed an application requesting a rate increase of if you round it off, about $53 million, which would have resulted in an average monthly increase of $5.91 per residential customer. In September of 2018, the Commission, in a unanimous decision, approved a settlement agreement in this case that cut electric rates for Westar customers by $66 million annually. For the average residential customer, that equates to a rate reduction of approximately $3.80 per month. This Commission decision also provided for a Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was, of course, the tax cut bill that President Trump signed off on early in 2018. We provided for, under that bill credits to Westar customers of approximately $50 million and upfront, in the form of upfront bill credits. Approximately 23 million of these credits represent cost savings from the economies of scale derived from the Commission-approved merger of Westar and KCP&L in May. A second major rate case was decided in December of 2018. In this instance, it involved Kansas City Power and Light. In May of 18, KCP&L had filed an application requesting a 4.5% rate increase totaling approximately $33 million. As a result of the Commission-approved merger of the KCP&L parent company, Great Plains Energy, and Westar, the requested increase was reduced to, I'm rounding up slightly here, $23 million. In December, the KCC, again in a unanimous decision, approved a settlement agreement that cut electric rates for KCP&L customers by $10.7 million annually and provided $36.9 million in bill credits that average approximately $100 per customer. For the average residential customer, the rate cut itself equates to a rate reduction of approximately $5 per year. Included within this rate decrease, however, are $7.5 million in cost savings realized again from the company's merger with Westar Energy. As an overview of utility rate making, I believe it would be safe to conclude that, as a general rule, customers favor higher utility rates. Do not favor higher utility rates.
We're just testing whether anybody's awake.
It's interesting. It's interesting during a former life when I served on the Kansas Board of Tax Appeals. Through the 4 years I was there and the thousands of cases that I heard, I never heard a single taxpayer argue that they were undertaxed. So, but again, Warren Buffett does not live in Kansas. He lives in Nebraska. Excuse that faux pas. Generally, utilities customers, I think, justifiably want to expect convenient and reliable service at reasonable rates. Due to concerns expressed within the Kansas legislature during the 2018 session, as well as by interveners in the 2018 Westar and KCP&L rate cases, in late 2018, the staff of the KCC Utilities Division undertook a study to identify, document, and explain the major differences between the electric rates of KCP&L and Westar in Kansas and the electric rates of comparable utilities in states adjacent to or near Kansas. This rate study was concluded in December of 2018 and has now been presented before committees of both houses of the 2019 Kansas legislature. The time frame covered by this study was the 10-year period from 2008 through 2018. The key findings from this rate study explain, I believe, why Kansas utility rates are marginally higher than the electric rates in nearby states. Let's briefly review these findings. First, Westar and KCP&L rate increases during this 10-year period were primarily due to the cumulative effect of increasing capital investments during a period of declining volumetric sales. This capital investment was driven by several factors, including mandated environmental regulations that required the retrofitting or closure of existing coal-fired generating units. These retrofit costs alone totaled $2.46 billion. $1.85 billion for Westar and $617 million for KCP&L, and that's for the KCP&L Kansas customers alone. Another major capital investment factor placing upward pressure on electric rates during the study time period was the construction of new fossil fuel generating facilities. The Emporia Energy Center is a gas-fired generation facility built by Westar at a cost of $305 million. The IATN 2 is a $760 million coal-fired generation facility built by KCP&L. In both instances, these generation facilities were evaluated for necessity prior to construction and were deemed necessary in order to meet forecasts for growing demand and to provide for more needed reliability to the grid when renewable generation was not operating. Yet another significant capital investment factor contributing to rate increases in Kansas was the development of new renewable generation facilities to comply with legislatively mandated renewable energy standards, or more recently, to take advantage of certain economic and long-term price stability factors offered by renewable energy. Westar has spent $690 million on wind farms, and KCP&L has spent $57 million. That's, again, the portion of KCP&L costs attributed to Kansas. They have spent $57 million on the Spearville 2 wind farm in Ford County. Also contributing to electric rate increases over the 10-year study period are the significant investments Westar made in its transmission system. This involves the upgrade and replacement of substantial parts of its aging transmission system. Furthermore, Westar has followed the Southwest Power Pool directives to build new transmission facilities to enable competitive wholesale markets and to aid in the development of renewable energy. The Southwest Power Pool, for those of you who may not know, is the regional transmission organization of which Kansas is one member. As you can discern from this summary, there are indeed serious costs associated with either the new construction of any form of electric power generation or with any shift from coal or gas-fired facilities to renewable energy facilities. Moreover, for purposes of comparison, it is really important to remember that there are three additional factors have affected Westar and KCP&L Kansas electric rates during the 2008 to 2018 time period, factors that did not affect their peer group utilities in nearby states. First, three nearby electric utilities with the largest rate declines from 2008 through 2017, and this is Entergy Texas, El Paso Electric, and the Public Service Company of Oklahoma. These companies also have the highest percentage of natural gas-fired generation capacity of the entire study group. By rough comparison, Kansas derives over 35% of its electric generation from renewable sources, primarily wind. A second factor that is a difference basically between Kansas and the adjoining states is that in contrast to Westar and KCP&L, non-Kansas electric utilities experiencing below average growth in rates during this 10-year period have not committed to, nor have they undertaken, a comparable level of capital investment necessary to environmentally retrofit coal-fired generating plants. Examples of this: Southwestern Public Service in Texas, Oklahoma Gas and Electric, and Union Electric in Missouri. And third, Some of the largest electric utilities in Texas have lower rates primarily derived from the significant growth in both their industrial and total retail electric sales. Again, this is derived primarily from population growth. And it's due in no small part to the cost savings that they realize from the economies of scale attributable to their relatively larger facilities. So what conclusions can we draw from a more nuanced consideration of comparative electric rates? In essence, utility rate making is not a series of isolated events. Rather, it is a complex process over several rate-making cycles, where each cycle is significantly influenced by ever-changing public policy preferences and directives. Furthermore, each successive rate-making cycle is influenced not only by legacy issues and historic cost considerations, but also by evolving public policy considerations that frequently become mandated by law. All right. The next major issue for our consideration this afternoon involves abandoned oil and gas wells in Kansas. Kansas is a mature and active oil and gas producing province. Within the United States, Kansas is the 9th largest oil and gas producing state and the 14th largest natural gas producing state. I think an interesting sidelight here is to consider the difference in oil production between the largest oil and gas producing state and Kansas. Any guesses as to which state is the largest oil and gas producing state? I heard Texas? Alaska? Other guesses? You're warm. Of course it's North Dakota. Why didn't you guess that? Isn't that staggering? It is staggering. It's North Dakota. The daily production in North Dakota is roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. Let's put that in relative terms. All of these other states that you mentioned basically have greater production than Kansas. They fall somewhere between North Dakota and Kansas. So Kansas being the 9th largest oil producing state, North Dakota being the 9th, and North Dakota being the largest. Here's how you put that in relative terms. It takes North Dakota 2.5 days to produce the equivalent of the annual production of Kansas oil producers. It is the 900-pound gorilla in the room in terms of, and this is all from the Bakken shale. This is shale production. It's an interesting phenomenon. Back to Kansas. Thousands of oil and gas wells have been drilled, completed, and produced throughout Kansas since the first well was drilled in Miami County in 1860. Since the #1 Norman well was completed in Neodesha in 1892, that opened up the eastern Kansas fields to exploration and development. Thereafter, the #1 Stapleton well was completed in 1915 as the discovery well for the El Dorado field, and the Cary Oswald #1 well was completed near Russell in 1923, initiating exploration and production development from the substantial oil and gas resources of western Kansas. Another aside, if I might, production from the El Dorado field was quite consequential roughly 100 years ago, because I think it's somewhat universally recognized that that oil substantially contributed to the Allied victory in World War I. For many reasons, a byproduct of all of this activity spread over many decades is abandoned wells throughout the state. When confronting the abandoned well problem in Kansas, either ignoring the problem or deferring consideration of remedies to some future indefinite time are not acceptable options. Abandoned wells do not resemble fine wines. They do not improve with age. While this is a significant, indeed a complex and a difficult issue of many moving parts, I believe with diligence, concerted effort, and coordinated effort of both the public and private sectors, this problem can, and with significant effort, will become manageable and resolvable. However, to address this issue in a meaningful way requires that several major initiatives be undertaken. One complexity associated with abandoned wells is the difficulty in identifying the responsible party for plugging. In the near term, this difficulty was compounded by constraints placed upon the easy responsible party identification created by a 2015 Kansas Court of Appeals decision. To overcome these constraints, we must develop new regulations to, among other things, more specifically identify the responsibility for abandoned well plugging under a variety of real-world circumstances, including those instances where the state's well plugging funds may become the responsible party. Second, we must utilize compliance agreements. Under these agreements, in exchange for an operator's commitment to plug abandoned wells in accordance with an agreed-to time schedule, the KCC forgoes requiring the operator to immediately plug all inactive or abandoned wells for which the operator is responsible. We're trying to match the realities of accomplishing well plugging that's commensurate with the cash flow capabilities of the operators. That is the succinct reason why that compliance agreement is so important. I think these compliance agreements clearly serve the public interest, since each well plugged under a compliance agreement is potentially one less well that could become a ward of the state's well plugging funds. In instances where the state's liability for well plugging has been absolutely established, the Commission must proactively engage in enhanced stewardship of the state's well plugging funds to assure that the Commission is optimizing those funds to plug as many abandoned wells as plugging fund resources allow. In past years, unexpended funds in the well plugging fee funds have been swept from these funds by the legislature and utilized for general fund purposes. Obviously, this practice does not place an adequate priority, in my opinion, on the protection of our freshwater resources. Please keep in mind, in every instance, the plugging of abandoned oil and gas wells is the responsibility of either individual operators or of the state's well plugging fee funds. The KCC Conservation Division budget and the well plugging fee funds are wholly funded by fees assessed upon the oil and gas industry and do not involve encumbrances or expenditures of any state general fund monies. Accordingly, the oil and gas industry pays all costs associated with plugging abandoned wells. The third major current issue for our consideration this afternoon involves recent seismic activity in Kansas. Generally, earthquakes either occur naturally or are caused by human activity. In the latter case, that is generically referred to as induced seismicity. The disposal of water produced in conjunction with oil and natural gas extraction has, under certain circumstances, been linked to induced seismicity. A brief history of earthquakes in Kansas reveals that. From 1981 through 2010, Kansas experienced 30 recorded earthquakes. In 2013, there were 4 recorded earthquakes in Kansas. In 2014, there were 127 recorded earthquakes in Kansas. During the first 3 months of 2015, there were 51 reported earthquakes in Kansas, and the majority of those occurred in Harper and Sumner counties. In February 2014, a task force consisting of representatives of the Kansas Geological Survey, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and the Kansas Corporation Commission was formed to study induced seismicity in Kansas. The task force recommended increased use of sensitive seismic monitoring equipment to help detect the strength and sources of some activity. And in many instances, keep in mind, in part, the reason why some of the higher numbers appear is that quite possibly in previous years we just didn't have the monitoring equipment in place to be able to detect it and record it. So that's in play here. Again, it's a complicated problem with many, no pun intended, moving parts. With regard to the disposal of produced water from oil and gas wells, The injection zone of potential seismic concern is confined to the Arbuckle. This is a producing or injection zone that lies just above the basement rock or granite. The Kansas Geological Survey has publicly acknowledged that the Arbuckle is the zone of potential induced seismic concern. They have also acknowledged that there is no evidence that the disposal or injection of produced water into other oil and gas bearing zones in Kansas shallow to the Arbuckle are the cause of or a risk factor for induced seismicity. From the outset of increased seismic activity in Kansas in 2014, the KCC has indeed taken a truly proactive approach, including the issuance of an order limiting the volume of saltwater injection in 5 distinct, as they described it, areas of concern in Harper and Sumner counties. Furthermore, the KCC staff has monitored the effects of reduced saltwater injections on seismic activity in this area by requiring operators to verify true vertical depths of their wells located inside the area of concern, and by instituting daily injection reports to be filed monthly with the KCC for all so-called large volume Arbuckle disposal wells, including those where injection exceeds 5,000 barrels of water per day. In addition, the Commission set a daily maximum injection level for wells outside the area of concern within Harper and Sumner County. Following an initial 180-day period of reduced injection volume, the Commission extended the order for another 180 days. While monitoring the effects of reduced saltwater injection after the initial Commission order, the KCC staff noticed a decrease in earthquakes that were of a 2.5 magnitude or larger in the areas of concern, but also noted an increase, in smaller earthquakes outside those areas. In response to that development, in August of 2016, the Commission issued a second order extending injection volume limits beyond the initial 5 areas of concern in Harper and Sumner counties to further include additional parts of Harper, Sumner, Kingman, Sedgwick, and Barber counties. The result? In the 2 years since the KCC issued its first order limiting saltwater injections in parts of the state, seismic activity has declined 66%. The KCC staff filed these findings in a report published in March of 2017. While the downward trend in seismic occurrences and magnitude can be viewed as a positive development, the latest KCC report specifically recommends further monitoring and data analysis. Candidly, current information about the origins and sources of seismic activity remains significantly inconclusive, there is absolutely a divergence of scientific opinion and conclusions regarding this matter. Further scientific analysis and study is required to more precisely determine actual earthquake causation and its relationship to human activity. Prospectively, and in the interest of an ongoing commitment to public safety, it is absolutely imperative that all relevant state agencies further scientifically investigate and study all possible causes of seismic activity in Kansas. This study must include all Arbuckle wells utilized for fluid disposal, whether they are so-called Class 2 wells, those are oil and gas disposal wells that are regulated by the Kansas Corporation Commission, or whether they are so-called Class 1 wells. These are Arbuckle industrial waste fluid wells that are regulated by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Finally, this afternoon, the last issue for us to consider involves natural gas pipeline safety. The importance of natural gas pipeline safety was highlighted certainly by events in Massachusetts in 2018 where low pressure natural gas systems were overpressured. It led to a series of massive explosions in densely populated residential areas. There was one fatality, however, there were multiple residential house fires and extensive property damage. Just yesterday, we have a clipping service in-house that one of our public affairs employees provides daily. And just yesterday, from that source, there were several reports chronicled of very recent pipeline safety concerns. For example, from Pennsylvania, federal investigators say a poorly installed natural gas connection is likely to blame for a gas explosion that killed a utility worker and destroyed 2 Pennsylvania homes in July of 2017. From California, a gas pipeline that exploded in flames in a San Francisco neighborhood earlier this month shows damage consistent with being ruptured by third-party excavators, according to the National Transportation Safety Board. From Washington, D.C., 5 days after a natural gas leak in Georgetown, people still cannot return to about 40 businesses and homes in that area. Obviously, the takeaway from these events is the necessity for gas pipeline operators, number one, to have good leak detection training programs, and number two, to have an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities, if you will, of their gas distribution systems. As an overview, the Kansas natural gas distribution system evidences great diversity. We have 3 large investor-owned gas distribution utilities: Atmos, Kansas Gas Service, and Black Hills. We have 1 large cooperative, that's Midwest Energy, 59 municipal operators, including the city of Winfield. We have 53 privately owned distribution and transmission systems. In sum, we have 118 operators of natural gas pipelines throughout Kansas. The commitment by Kansas natural gas utilities to safety and to customer service, I think, is somewhat evidenced by the fact that during the course of any recent year, there have been relatively few customer outages. The KCC requires that gas pipeline system operators notify the Commission of outages when 50 or more customers are affected. In recent years, there have been less than 10 of these outages in any given year, statewide. When outages occur, mutual aid agreements, particularly among municipal operators, generally ensure that service is fairly promptly restored. The commitment by Kansas pipeline operators to public safety is also evidenced by the extensive participation of their personnel in various training seminars and courses presented by the KCC throughout the state. As with other forms of infrastructure, gas pipelines are most often out of sight and out of mind. As a result, gas customers frequently run the risk of taking gas distribution systems for granted, especially when an awareness of potential problems and reporting those problems is really quite necessary. Underground pipelines do age, and especially so in the case of bare steel pipelines that were installed 50 years ago and have reached or exceeded their economic life. In 2017, the Commission issued an order requiring Atmos, Kansas Gas Service, and Black Hills, again, the 3 largest natural gas distribution utilities in Kansas, to develop and implement replacement plans for their antiquated and undesirable piping. These plans have been filed with the Commission and undergo continuous review. Prospectively and taken together, this is a little staggering, but Atmos, Kansas Gas Service, and Black Hills have estimated that they will spend approximately $2.3 billion over the next 35 years to replace all of the cast iron and bare steel lines in their systems. These replacement steps could significantly and obviously improve gas pipeline safety for customers by reducing the chances of leaks caused by pipeline failures. Although these 3 large gas utilities serve over 90% of Kansas customers, the remaining pipeline operators, that is principally the municipals, the cooperatives, and other small operators, must also be concerned about their aging pipeline infrastructure. Kansas regulations require operators to maintain customer yard lines and perform regular leak surveys in an effort to prevent accidents. While responding to leaks is obviously a vital part of pipeline safety, the response to a pipeline failure or a leak simply does not reach the same level of public safety as a focused commitment and a focused, committed effort to prevent pipeline leaks in the first place. This is clearly where our oversight efforts are focused. I begin my remarks this afternoon with a quote from Groucho Marx. It seems only appropriate to conclude my remarks by sharing an observation of Ronald Reagan's. No disagreement there, right? President Reagan once analogized the spending habits of the government to a baby's alimentary canal by suggesting that it had an insatiable appetite on one end and no sense of responsibility on the other. Indeed, well, rest assured, a major objective of the KCC is not to emulate or mirror President Reagan's analogy. Indeed, I believe that we do have an acute sense about the consequential nature of our responsibilities. Our focus and commitment is the pursuit of excellence in state government, and toward that end, we strive to be responsible, accountable, and oriented to results that serve the long-term public interests of Kansans. I very much appreciate your indulgence this afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keene, for being here. Question, KCC made a decision, I'm not sure exactly how long ago it was, but it takes effect here in, I believe, April 1st, that requires electric utilities to mark lines that they don't own. It puts them in a position where they don't own the lines. It's past their point of demarcation, but according to the ruling that I read, it makes them liable because they are quote-unquote operators of those lines and should have the knowledge of where they were at to mark them. I would like your take on the logic behind that ruling.
I'm going to give you an answer to your question, and you can determine whether or not I provided logic. That is a matter that is currently before the Kansas legislature. There is a bill pending right now that addresses that very subject. I think there are efforts to try to work out the differences, to work through these concerns that the utilities have, and I understand that. I mean, they don't want to be responsible for secondary lines they may not know exist, or once it goes beyond basically the transformer or the meter, they have concerns there. And I think there's an effort through the process of that legislation to try to strike a balance so that all the competing needs here can at least be considered and resolved in some way. That's the best I can give you. I think there's a concern. I think it's legitimate. I appreciate your question.
Chairman Keene, does the Corporation Commission have authority over gathering systems as well as pipelines in terms of oil and gas? And does it have within its purview the relative bargaining position of producers versus gathering systems and pipelines?
I'm sorry, Malcolm, restate the last half of your question.
Does the Commission have within its purview the relative bargaining position of producers versus pipelines and gathering systems?
We're not an intermediary in negotiating the terms of these kinds of contracts. No, that's not a function of government in my view, and it's a matter for the private sector to resolve. With respect to the first half of your question, which is the regulation of gathering lines, if there's an environmental hazard created, yes. I mean, those are extensions of tank batteries, wells, that sort of thing.
Yeah, my name is John Custer, and I live out in King County. And several years ago, a fellow that was the leader speaker of the House, Kansas House, Ray Walsh, I believe, or yeah, that's right. He told us that the windmills were going to go away.
I'm sorry, he told you what would go away?
The windmills were going to go away.
Huh.
The wind farms were going to go away.
That didn't work, did it?
Boy, it sure didn't. And of course, our business, Kansas Manufacturing businesses are all at a disadvantage because of the high rates of electricity. And I would like to know if you have an opinion on why he wasn't able to do that. Why he wasn't.
I'm sorry, sir. My hearing. You want my opinion about what again? Say that again, please.
Why was they not able to make the wind farms go away? Where was his failure? If you have an opinion.
I wouldn't speculate on that in quite the way you presented it, but I'll try to be responsive to what I think is the heart of your question. It's the ability in this country to utilize private property in ways that private property owners think they want to utilize them, unless there's a public policy concern. There was another bill that has been considered, introduced in the current session of the legislature, that would provide, with respect to future construction of wind generators, it would provide setbacks from houses a certain number of feet, setbacks from schools, setback from it's a whole cat list. My thinking is, I wouldn't want to be quoted on this absolutely, but I believe that bill was considered in a House committee. I think it was a House committee, and did not make it out of committee. It was not voted out. I believe that's correct. I think the other reason why there's been a proliferation of wind generators is because there is a desire in many quarters to have alternative energy sources and so-called renewable sources, of which that is a primary energy source. That has been undergirded by mandates within Kansas law and tax incentives at the federal level that have, I think, contributed to what it is we see as the proliferation of wind generators throughout the state. That's the best answer, sir, I can possibly give to you.
Thank you.
Was it semi-responsive to what you asked?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Well, it's the best I can do. Absolutely true.
Businesses in the state of Kansas are suffering disadvantages because of
John, you had your question. I'm sorry, so we got 4 minutes.
I have 2 quick questions. The first one relates to the last one. How does the cost of the non-carbon generation today come through to the customer as compared with our standard coal or gas fire? That's question 1. Number 2 is, on the matter of abandoned oil wells.
If I could, let me answer that first, and then I'll address your second one here. You're dealing with an ancient brain here, so let's not overtax it too much this afternoon. Basically, what happens is it becomes a capital investment, and it's built into the rate base, and so that all ratepayers, it becomes a fixed cost of operation, and all ratepayers are going to share as the tariff dictates in the cost and operation of that facility. Did that answer that half?
Well, not entirely, because there's not only the capital cost, which must be amortized, but there's also the operating.
Yeah, I mentioned operating.
Everybody says wind is free, and we know that's not quite true. We have maintenance costs. How does it ultimately come through to the customer for the total, as compared with the capital cost?
It's built into the rate base and into the tariff. That's how it comes to you as the customer, and it may depend upon the usage in any given month.
And I intended to ask, how does that compare with the traditional carbon-based generation?
See, that's a very good question, and I tried to address that in part by the contrast that I was alluding to within the scope of that rate study that indicated that basically the lowest electric rates within our region, if you want to include Texas to be reasonably proximate to Kansas, is basically in southwest and central Texas, where the large, overwhelming proportion of their electric generating energy is provided by gas-fired generators. It's significantly lesser.
And second question, with regard to the abandoned wells, are you now requiring a bond before a person can drill a well because he may go broke and you won't be around to pay for it to close it?
Fabulous question. The answer is no. I'm Joe Friday. You want the truth and nothing but the truth. That's what I'm here to give you. The fact is that, and I believe it is something that both the commission and the industry will have to come to a point of reckoning about at some time in the future, pardon me, is what level of financial assurance is required with respect to certain activities in the oil patch to actually provide the protections that the kind of financial assurances you're alluding to would provide. Is that a better answer?
It's not the answer I was hoping for, because we ought to insist that a bond be there to take care of it if the man goes broke, if the driller goes broke. You need a bond to ultimately get it plugged. Do we concur on that?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
I thought your question was much broader.
We're going to go over about 5 minutes. If anyone needs to leave, please feel free to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Back when we had KG&E and we built Westar, KCP&L didn't want to pay their share of creating that plant. Now that it's, I guess, nearing or past its operational life, are there plans to replace it? So is there a license in place for a second or third nuclear plant? How are we going to replace that generation, and what's KCC doing to keep the plant safe? I know, lots of pieces to that one.
Well, Phil, let me try to answer the last question first. There's some continuous oversight. And as I indicated during my presentation, we're working toward a decommissioning date. And a big concern is, what do we do with spent nuclear fuels? Our partner in that effort is the federal government, largely because of the Yucca facility and the like. And it's fair to say there's a large degree of uncertainty about whether or not that's going to be an available site and whether other sites are going to be available. So it's a huge problem. Your first question again related to the historic differences in rates before the merger. And as a pretty much a lifelong resident of South Central Kansas, I'm somewhat familiar with that. I'm not sure what your question is as we fast forward to today.
There's not going to be an equitable adjustment based on South Central Kansas is assuming a significant proportion of the cost of construction and maintenance, and so the KCP&L customers are going to receive the economic benefit of those higher rates paid for decades.
I did understand that. I think, again, as I suggested in my presentation, rates are a progression. It's not a single event-driven thing. They're a progression, and they have legacy issues that come with them. I think this is a legacy issue. I don't think there's a silver bullet out there that's going to give you the answer you want to hear.
Like 4 of you can do that.
I'm sorry?
How many's on the board? 7?
3.
3? Oh, 2 of you can do that.
Just like that, huh? Okay.
Thank you for your comments today, sir. I'm a new transplant to Kansas to the family and everything, so hello everyone, Pat Penn. I just want to ask you one quick question. All politics being local, we know that the federal legislators are saying that they want to do the Green New Deal. We see that the 2020 candidates for the president are, pushing the party and the conversation that way. My concern and question for you would be, here at the Kansas level, what exactly would be that impact? What does that look like in light of what you told us today? I know that they'll try to use some of the challenges that you've mentioned to help further that particular feeling toward that policy? Or what is the brass knuckles, if we want to put it in talking points, what does that look like?
We saved the easiest question till last. Is that it? Thank you. The Green New Deal. A bit beyond the purview of the Kansas Corporation Commission. We're a function of the legislature, and we do what they direct us to do. So you'd have to wait and see how that evolves over time.
Let's thank Dwight King. Thank you, Dwight.
Thank you, Dwight.